Welcome to the church family that is lifting lives through living love, inspiring hope, filling with faith, and transforming our world. These recorded messages are made available so that you might have additional opportunities to stay connected with us and that you might learn and grow in your faith. God bless you as you hear the word today. And now, the message.
Our scripture reading this morning is from Micah 6, 1 through 8. Listen to what the Lord says. Stand up, plead my case before the mountains. Let the hills hear what you have to say. Hear, you mountains, the Lord's accusation. Listen, you everlasting foundations of the earth. For the Lord has a case against his people. He is lodging a charge against Israel. My people, what have I done to you? How have I burdened you? Answer me. I brought you up out of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. I sent Moses to lead you, also Aaron and Miriam. My people, remember what Balak, king of Moab, plotted and what Balaam, son of Beor, answered. Remember your journey from Shittim to Gilgal, that you may know the righteous acts of the Lord. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of olive oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. May the Lord add his blessing to the reading and hearing of his word.
There's an old Russian fable which Dostoevsky relates in his book, The Brothers Karamazov. And the story's about a peasant woman who was a very, very wicked woman, as the story goes. So wicked, in fact, that when she died, she had not a single good deed to her name. And so the devil snatched her up and cast her down into the lake of fire. But she has a guardian angel who is watching over her, and this guardian angel goes and intercedes before God and pleads for her case. And God asks, did she do anything good in her entire life? And the guardian angel thinks about it and says, well, once she plucked an onion from her garden and gave it to another beggar woman. And so God says, well, then go to her and extend down this onion. Let her catch hold of it and see if it is enough to pull her from the lake of fire. And so the angel does. He holds down the onion and says, grab hold. And she does. And he begins to pull. And sure enough, it is strong enough. She begins to be raised up out of the lake of fire. But then other sinners who are around her, seeing that she is being pulled out, see this as their chance, and they begin to grab hold of her arms and her legs, hoping thereby to be pulled out to salvation. And the woman begins to fear. I mean, the onion could barely hold her weight. How is it going to hold others? And so she begins to kick and push and yell, get off me! This isn't your onion, it's mine. And as soon as she says those words, the onion breaks. It's an interesting story, isn't it? I read it, back in college, I believe. It was a long time ago, but it always stuck in my imagination. What struck me then and still kind of fascinates me now is the idea that this onion would have been enough. It would have been sufficient to pull the woman out, and not just to pull the woman, but to pull anyone who was holding on to her. It wasn't the onion that wasn't enough. It was when the onion broke. It was when she said the words, it's not yours, it's mine. It was her own heart which condemned her. We're in this series on greatest hits, and today we're talking about the great requirement, so named because Micah the prophet asks, what does the Lord require of you but to do justice Love mercy and walk humbly with your God. But it makes us ask the question, is whatever is enough? That's what the Israelites are asking. Micah's kind of doing a back and forth between God and the Israelites, speaking for both of them. And so the verses right before Micah 6:8 it's the Israelites' turn to speak. And they're asking God, well, what do you require, God? What do you need from us? With what shall we come before the exalted Lord? Shall we come with offerings, with calves a year old? What about 1,000 rams? What about 10,000 rivers of oil? I mean, the numbers and proportions, they're just ridiculous. What if should we come before you with our firstborn? Would that satisfy you, God? Would that be enough? Have you ever asked that question? Have you ever been in that situation? Maybe not in relationship with God, but maybe in a different relationship where no matter what you did, it was never, ever enough. Maybe it was a project at work that you kept pouring yourself into more and more and more, or trying to help someone perhaps. And all your efforts to help them, it felt like you were just pouring yourself into a bottomless bucket. Like no matter what you did, you were never going to fill that need. I sometimes feel that way when I go to Haiti. For those of you who don't know, my wife and I have worked in Haiti the last 15 years, and it's a very special and dear place to our heart, but it can also be exhausting. Because Jamel and I have worked in the same community for the past 15 years. Everyone knows us. And so when we go to Haiti, it's kind of, it's almost an endless procession of people who are seeking me out, asking if they can get some help of some kind. And I got over the years, I would get so overwhelmed with this that I started writing down, making a list. And the list was twofold. One was to help me remember that so-and-so had asked for something, like a new pair of shoes or whatever. But sometimes it was just so I could say to people, like I couldn't meet their need, but I could say, okay, I'll write your name down. Here it is on my list. And I've kept all these lists over the years. Most of the needs I've been unable to do anything about. Some of the requests are for technology, laptops for work or for school, cell phones, DVD players that families want because they don't have electricity, so those portable DVD players that can charge up, those are a great gift to them. Sometimes people ask for money for doctor's bills or for medicine, or they ask for help with paying for school, if not for themselves, then for their son or for their daughter. The most frequent request I get is always around housing. People say, can you buy a couple sacks of cement? Can you buy 10 sheets of tin for my roof? I need to replace the ones that are rotted and rusted. The requests go on and on. When Jamel and I started the nonprofit Zombie Fondwa this last year, we decided to focus on housing because it was a need that was prevalent throughout the community, but also because it would create jobs and opportunities for people. And so Jamelin kind of designed a program very similar to Habitat for Humanity, that people would put in some sweat equity, they would attend classes to learn how to manage a house, they would contribute financially to a portion of the house, and there was an application process, and there were Haitian leaders, a team of 6 that were in charge of this. And what they did is they set up office hours every Monday that they would receive applications. The first day that they received applications, over 75 families came and asked for a home, put their name on the list. They waited a week until the next Monday. When the next Monday rolled around, they went to the clinic where they were keeping office hours. There were people who'd been lined up for hours just waiting to get in and see them. By the end of the day, they had over 200 families whose names were on the list. And at that point, Jamelin had to tell them, stop taking names. We can't do anymore. We can't even begin to meet this need. Have you ever felt like no matter what you did, it's never, ever enough? For me, it's a challenge to keep my heart open. When people say, I want you to come and see my home, I want you to see where I live, I know what they want to show me, I know what they want me to see, and I have to keep some part of my heart open to imagine, experience their reality and to honor their request, knowing that at the same time, I can't do anything about it, because no matter what I want to do, the need is endless, and the resources aren't enough. But then I come home. And I come back to a nice home with warm showers and excess that my Haitian friends just couldn't even believe. And I look around at all that we have, and I have to wrestle with the question, have I done enough? What could ever be enough? There's a story in the New Testament where a man approaches Jesus. I left my Bible over here, so I'll go pick it up. It's Matthew chapter 19. And a young man approaches Jesus with much that same question. He comes to Jesus and he asks him, "Teacher, what good thing must I do to get eternal life? What would be enough?" And Jesus replies, "Well, if you want to enter life, obey the commandments." "Which ones?" the man asks, which I think is kind of funny, but he's not being snarky. As we talked about last week, there are 613 individual commandments in the Old Testament. So which ones are the important ones, he's asking Jesus. And Jesus replies back. He says, "Well, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't lie, honor your father and mother." There are 5 commandments from the 10 commandments, the second half of the 10 commandments, that all have to do with loving people. And so Jesus summarizes them by saying, "And love your neighbor as yourself." The young man listens to all that and he's kind of thinking, well, I don't steal. I've never killed anyone. I haven't cheated on my wife. For the most part, I'm honest and I take care of my parents and I get along with my neighbors. Check, 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 check. So he says, all these that I have kept, the young man said. But he's not satisfied. There's a disquiet in his soul. There's something, he didn't get the answer he was looking for, and so he asks another question. He says, "What else do I lack?" Now that's a dangerous question to ask someone like Jesus. What else do I lack? And Jesus replies, "If you want to be perfect, then go. Sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And then come and follow me." And when the young man heard this, he went away sad, because he had great wealth. Don't you ever wish that Jesus had answered that question differently? I mean, don't you wish that Jesus had said to this young man, "Well, hey, no, just keep on keeping on. Just keep doing what you're doing. It's all good. You're on the right path. Just keep it up. Wouldn't that be nice? You're doing enough. Keep it up." Or maybe at the least Jesus could have said, "Well, there's this thing called the tithe. Give 10% of your possessions, and then you're good. Just make sure you tithe." But Jesus doesn't say tithe. He doesn't say 10%. He doesn't say half. He says all. Sell all your possessions and give them to the poor. And I think we can all resonate with the despair that the young man feels. All? Is that what you're asking? That's such a high bar to clear, Jesus. Could we ever give enough? You see, Jesus is clear again and again about what is enough for God. 2 commandments. We talked about them last week. Love God, love people. It's simple, really. But it's not the commandments themselves, it's the qualifiers that Jesus adds to them. It's not just to love God. You got to love God with all your heart and your soul and your mind and your strength. Not half, not some, everything you got. And when you love people, Jesus kind of expands that definition of neighbor. It's not just people who look like you or live near you. It's people who are different from you. It's the foreigner in your midst. It's the enemy. It's the untouchable. It's anyone who has need. Love your neighbor. How? The way you love yourself. And because Jesus paints them in such broad terms, I believe it's one way of saying that it's never enough. It's never a box that you could check and say, "I'm done, I've taken care of those things." No, rather it's something you spend your whole life learning to do better and better and better, to keep loving God, to keep growing in how you love others. In other words, it's not a bar you have to clear. It's a journey that you have to take. I believe when Jesus was telling this young man to sell his possessions. It wasn't, hey, you have to do this if you want to enter eternal life. It wasn't a bar he had to clear or a box he needed to check. It was a journey that Jesus was inviting him to begin. You see, I know Jesus. I believe Jesus loved that young man. And when he told him to do that, it was because perhaps Jesus knew that in the process of selling his possessions, he would discover that his possessions controlled and dominated him in a way that he never realized how much freer he could be if he wasn't worried about stuff so much. Perhaps Jesus knew that as he gave things away, he would discover a quality of life, an open-handed, generous way of living that was so much better than hoarding and holding on and being afraid. Jesus was inviting him into infinite, abundant life. And the only question was whether this young man was willing to trust and take that step. You see, loving God and loving people, they're the guardrails that define the journey in which we are to walk. They're not boxes that we would ever check. And so it is with Micah 6:8. God says, he has shown you, O Lord, what is good. And what does the Lord require? But to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Those aren't boxes we check. They're journeys that we have to take. And they aren't easy journeys. Doing justice is hard work. It requires us to take risks, like these men and women take every night when they patrol. It requires us to be uncomfortable. It requires us to ask hard questions. It requires us to look our own privilege in the face and wrestle with what does God want us to do with it? How do we share it with others? It's hard work. And loving mercy is hard too. Because there are times where you do feel tapped out, worn out. You don't have anything to offer. Will you still love mercy? Will you still be kind? Will you still treat others the way you want to be treated? To me, the grace is in the third one. Walking humbly with God. The Hebrew word for walk is halak. It doesn't refer to the physical act of putting one step in front of the other. It's rather a connotation of a journey, a lifelong journey that God invites us into. And to me, this is the grace that doing justice is hard, loving mercy isn't easy all the time. But God makes this promise that if you walk humbly with me, I will lead you every step of the way. I once had a friend who was wrestling with faith, questions of faith. He said, I just never really understood this relationship with Jesus thing. I mean, how do you have a relationship with someone who lived 2,000 years ago? And he put it, after we were talking, at one point he asked this question. He said, so if I get to the end of my life, and I've loved people and I've done good deeds, I've lived a good life, but I've never had a relationship with Jesus, will I get to go to heaven? And I said, first off, I don't really know. Maybe. I can't say how Jesus is going to judge, but I think if that's the case, you will have missed out on something essential. I thought of the rich young ruler's question, what else do I lack? And I said, it sounds to me like you're hungering for something more. There's something in your spirit that wants more, and I would encourage you to listen to it and follow it and pursue it. Because if I get to the end of my life and I've done justice and I've loved mercy, but I've missed out on walking humbly with my God, then I've missed the very best part. It's a gift that we get to walk with our God. You scan through the New Testament, and yes, we have stories like today where it makes us feel like nothing would ever be enough. But if you read through the New Testament, it's interesting how often Jesus does pronounce enough over other people. There's a story about one day they're in the temple, and an old woman comes in and she has 2 pennies, and she puts them in the treasury box. And what does Jesus say? He says, gather around, look at this. She has put in enough. There's a day where he is preaching and teaching, and 5,000 men, so we don't even know how many women and children, a huge crowd has gathered, and people are hungry and tired, and they know they need to feed them. And the disciples start looking around, who has food they can share? And a little boy comes forward with 2 loaves and 5 fishes. And what does Jesus say? It's enough. One day he's at a friend's house, Lazarus, and a young woman comes in and she takes some ointment, some expensive nard, and she breaks open the container and pours it on his feet and begins wiping them with her hair. And the disciples are shocked and outraged by this because they say, this ointment, this perfume, it could have been sold. We could have done so much more to help others. And Jesus says, no. What she is doing for me right now is enough. One day he's teaching, and the crowd is so thick around it that 4 men climb up on top with their friends, and they break a hole in the roof and they lower their friend down. And when Jesus sees their faith, he says, "It is enough. Arise, your sins are forgiven. Take your mat and walk." And then one day Jesus is nailed to a cross, and next to him is a thief who simply says, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus says that simple prayer is enough. What do they all have in common? The stories, I could tell more, but what do all those stories have in common? It's not the size of the offering or the size of the faith even. It's the simplicity and the humility of the offering. It's the fact that all those people gave all they had. They entrusted who they were. And Jesus blessed it and said, "It's enough." And the reality is that we don't save ourselves. We don't. We could never do enough to earn our way into heaven, and we don't do enough to save the world either. No matter what we do, there's always more we could give, and there's always more need than we could possibly meet. But God just asks us to walk with him, to do justice and to love mercy and to trust that in his grace, God can make it enough. The relationship we have with Jesus is not a bar that we'll never clear. No, the relationship we have with Jesus is the one time when he said on the cross, "It is finished." That for all time was enough, and he simply asks us to trust in it and walk in it and live in his grace and share it freely and openly with others. That is the journey of enough. I close with a movie, one of my favorite movies of all time, Schindler's List. How many of you have seen Schindler's List? For those of you who haven't, a handful of hands didn't go up. It's about Oskar Schindler, who was a German industrialist, a man of great wealth and importance and influence living in Germany at the time of World War II. And word got around that Schindler's factories were safe places in which Jews could work at a time where Jews weren't safe just about anywhere. And he kept taking in more and more workers into his factories, trying to provide them a safe haven. But then finally, the war was coming to an end, the Allies were advancing, and the Nazis moved into what we know today as their final solution, the mass slaughter of so many Jews, the Holocaust. And so Oskar Schindler in that moment knew that the only way he could keep them safe was to buy their freedom. And so he made a list of all of those workers and their families and their friends. And there was a price put on every single head. And so he leveraged every ounce of his wealth, every ounce of his influence to buy their safety and security. And it worked. Oskar Schindler in total saved 1,100 men, women, and children from certain death. Today, there are over 6,000 descendants who are alive through that sacrifice. But then what happens at the end of the movie is the tables are turned. The Nazis pull out, and the Allies are advancing, and suddenly it's Schindler whose life is in danger because, after all, he's a wealthy German industrialist, the kind of man that the Allies were hunting down. And so he has to escape to find his way to freedom. And so he's going to leave under the cover of night, kind of get away in his car. But when he goes to his car, the last scene of the movie, or next to last scene, I should say, is when he goes to his car, he finds hundreds of women, men, and children who are gathered there. All the men that he has helped save, all the women he's helped save, and they present him with a letter. And the letter describes what he has done, and to it, every single person, 1,100 people, have written their signatures. Think about that. this list that he began in order to save them becomes his own salvation. But in that moment, he doesn't experience gratitude or happiness. Instead, the emotion he experiences in that moment is one of remorse and guilt. He begins to look at all the things he still has. He looks at his car and says, this car, it would have been enough to save 10 more people. This gold lapel pin, why did I keep this? This could have been 2 more people. This watch, it could have been 5. He begins going down the list, and he realizes, even though he's done so much, he could have done more. And his soul is crushed, and he falls to the ground weeping. And in that moment, it's the women and men and children who gather around him, and they become the onion that pulls him out of that pit of despair. They're the ones who tell him, it's okay. You've done enough. And Jesus says, this is what it will be like, perhaps, on the day of his second coming, because on that day he'll divide the righteous from the unrighteous, and to the righteous he will say, blessed are you, and enter into your reward. For I was sick, and you took care of me. I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me water. I was naked, you gave me clothing. I was in prison, and you visited me. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was homeless, and you gave me shelter. And the righteous will reply, oh Lord, when did we see you sick or hungry or in prison? When did we see you in any of these conditions? And Jesus will reply, as you have done it for the least of these, my brethren, so you have done it for me. And that, by God's grace, will be enough. Amen.